Hello, this is intended to be part one of a two-part video presentation on Congress. So we're going to be working our way through, in this course, the three branches of government that you've learned about since you were a very young child. And so this is the first look at the first branch of government. So what I'm going to be focusing on in part one and part two of this presentation are really, I'm going to go straight to the Constitution. And so I would suggest that you, if you're watching this video, that you have a copy of the Constitution. And those are easy to find. Your textbook, depending on what textbook you're using, your textbook typically will have a copy of the Constitution. And so what I would do is I would make use of the pause button, and I would have the Constitution laid out, because I'm going to be referring to just a few things. And of course, you'll need to use your textbook. And what I would suggest that you do is you view this presentation and supplement that with your textbook. Those two items should be studied together. So now we're looking at the very first branch of government, and we're looking we're looking at some of the constitutional provisions. So let's just go ahead and move along here. So it's considered the first branch of government. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, it is the very first of the three branches that's addressed. And if you're looking at pure ink in the Constitution itself, the Congress gets more ink than really the other two branches put together. So there was a lot of concern about the structure and the procedures in Congress when the Constitution was created. And a reminder that the Constitution was drafted really in 1787 and then ratified by all 13 states in 1789. And when each one of the 50 states joined the Union, just keep this in mind, that they were, in essence, part of what they were doing when they joined the Union is they were submitting to the provisions of the U.S. Constitution. Otherwise, they would not have been going into the Union as a state intelligently. So I'm sure that each state's leaders at that time were looking at the U.S. Constitution and looking at the provisions, understanding where the states sit in respect to the power of the national government. And since you've probably already looked at the subject of federalism, you know that in the U.S. Constitution is something also called the Supremacy Clause. So just keep this in mind, that each one of the states, when they joined the Union, were submitting themselves to the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution, which means that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Okay, so let's move along here. So the term Congress itself is really just a very, very generic term, I guess you could say. We here in the United States, when we talk about Congress with a capital C, we're talking about a very, very specific group of men and women in Washington, D.C. So anytime you're talking about the specific Congress, it is, of course, a capital C. But the term itself is used in many other contexts in 2021. And when it's used that way, it's usually a reference to some sort of an assembly or a group of people. Also want you all to keep in mind that the Constitution that we now call the U.S. Constitution, remember, is actually our second go at it. We had an original Constitution, which are called the Articles of Confederation. I typically touch on that subject more in our introduction to federal government classes, usually in the very first module, or at least in the second module when we talk about federalism. That's typically how I put my classes together. But the Articles of Confederation, the original Constitution, which lasted about 7-8 years, also had a Congress. In fact, you may recall, if you've looked at that the Congress is the only branch that existed in the Articles of Confederation and that were carried over into the Constitution. So when the Articles of Confederation were being followed by the leaders of the United States of America, there was not an executive branch in the Articles, and there was not a judicial branch. The only branch that they had was a branch that was called Congress, And it was actually just one chamber. So we're going to learn more about the bicameral Congress that we have here. But in the Articles of Confederation, the original Congress in the United States was actually unicameral. There was only one chamber. So again, the concept of a Congress was actually there in the very beginning. So let's get right to the Constitution and the provisions itself. As I've already noted, Congress is the first of the three branches formed by the Constitution. It was the only one that existed in the Articles of the three branches. It was the only one that existed in the Articles of Confederation. And then when early Americans in 1787 began to draft this Constitution, and then in 1789 when they ratified the Constitution, that same branch carried over in all three. It is the very first branch that's created by the U.S. Constitution. If you go to Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, right after the preamble, you're going to find a description of Congress. Now, you may recall that one of the things that I have probably shared with you all in the very beginning of this course is that constitutions do two things very generally. The first thing that they do is create a government. And the second thing that that Constitution is going to do is provide operating instructions for that government. So what we're going to be looking at is the creation of the government, and then some of the operating instructions that are found in the Constitution itself for the branch that we know as Congress. So it was deemed to be the most important of the three branches. That's why it's named first. In fact, if you go to some of the writings of James Madison, who is considered the architect of the U.S. Constitution, if you look at some of his writings in the Federalist Papers, you may recall what that is. It's very clear that James Madison says that in a democratic republic, which is a representative form of democracy, it's not direct democracy, it's a representative form. So we don't make the laws directly. We vote people into office, and those people make the laws. That's what a representative democracy is. That's what a Republican form of government is. James Madison wrote in 1778, right after the Articles of Confederation, or rather right after the U.S. Constitution was drafted, but before it was ratified, he wrote that in a Republican form of government, it's only natural that the legislative branch, which is the lawmaking branch, be the dominant branch, be the most powerful branch. It all starts there. So the other two branches, the executive branch and the judiciary branch, frankly, they were designed to be reactionary branches. In other words, if the judicial branch's job, among other things, is to interpret the law or to resolve conflicts between two parties about the law, well, where does that all start? It starts with the creation of the law. So it starts with the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch. And the same thing with the executive branch. If you think about just the term, the executing branch, what are they actually executing? Well, a play has got to be created, and that is what the Congress is all about. So the executive branch, the president, is charged with the constitutional duty to enforce the law, to execute the law, but it all starts with the law. So the way that James Madison envisions these three branches of government, the first would be and the most dominant, the most powerful would be the lawmaking branch. It's listed first. And also, oftentimes the comment is made that it's the branches closest to the people. Well, there are a number of things that are intended to be understood by a statement like that. And that is the branch of the three that's closest to the people. It's real easy from the judicial branch to understand this. The judicial branch are somewhat separated and isolated from elections. They don't get elected. They're nominated and appointed, which we'll learn more about in this course. They certainly don't go through elections. And so those people are isolated in the judicial branch to a large degree, not entirely, but to a large degree from political influences. the pressure that the people can put on the branches of government. The Constitution sets up the judicial branch as being somewhat isolated from that pressure. And if you take a look at the President of the United States really represents the entire country. Okay, so he's got millions and millions and millions, several hundred million people in this 2021 presentation that he works for, and he's bound with the duty to protect them. But if you think about the legislative branch, and you'll learn more about this as you go along, you'll know that that every state has 2 U.S. senators that go into the U.S. Senate, and every state will have a number of members in the House that it will send to the U.S. House of Representatives based upon that state's population. So if you take a look at Texas, just as an example. Now, Texas was just told a few months ago that it was going to get 2 more seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. So as I'm making this video, that number is set at 36. But when all the census data is back and reapportionment and redistricting take place in the state of Texas, we're actually going to have 2 more seats. We're going to have 38 seats. So think about that. The entire state of Texas is divided up into 38 congressional districts. So you're looking at roughly 1 million people in each one of those districts, and maybe not quite that much, but let's just say 1 million people in each one of those districts. If you've got 30 million people in the state of Texas, then each one of the 2 U.S. senators from Texas are going to represent 30 million people, each of them. But if you've got 300,000 people in the United States of America, the president represents all of them. So what I'm trying to say is with this explanation of what this means, the branch closest to the people, it means that the people, the men and women in the U.S. House and the men and women in the U.S. Senate, actually of all the 3 branches, represent the smallest segment of the people. And even we can zero in on the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, when they're elected, they're only guaranteed 2 years. The president gets 4 years. U.S. senators get 6 years. Members of the judicial branch, depending on what court we're talking about, but if we're talking about the courts that are created by Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, they're there for life. It's a lifetime appointment. But members of the U.S. House are only there for 2 years. So this is another part of that expression, the branch closest to the people. In other words, they can get fired. They can get fired pretty quickly. So they represent a very small segment of the U.S. population within their state compared to the other branches of government, and they are very, very answerable to the people because they can get fired after 2 years. So let's go down to Article 1. So Article 1 is divided up into a number of sections, and in our look at the Constitution and in our look at federalism, we've already been looking at the Constitution parts of it. But I wanted to let you know that what's in there. So the legislative powers, if you think about the term legislature or to legislate, that simply means to make law. So let's just get that out of the way. To legislate something means to make law. 2 chambers are created in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 1, remember that Constitution, the first things that it's going to do is create government. Well, in Article 1, Section 1, which addresses Congress, the first thing that it does is create 2 chambers. So you've got a Senate and a House. Now, what follows in Article 1 is going to be a little more explanation about each one of those chambers. We're going to see what the Constitution has to say about the House and what the Constitution has to say about the Senate, both structure and operating instructions. Now, why 2 chambers? Well, you'll have to go back and take a look at what you learned in our first module, the first parts of this course about the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. So really the great compromise was the creation of 2 different chambers in the House of, with the House of Representatives and the Senate. So remember that the Senate represents equality between the states because every state has 2 people that are represented in Congress. And the House of Representatives represents not equality between the states, but disparity between the states, differences between the states, because some states have more people than others. So Texas, with 38 seats in our next Congress, is going to be going to have a whole lot more influence in the U.S. House of Representatives than Wyoming, who only has one seat in the House. So this is a compromise. You may recall that the New Jersey plan, the Senate is represented, the New Jersey plan is represented in the Senate, equality between the states. The Virginia plan is represented in the U.S. House, where representation in Congress is based upon a state's population. So the Great Compromise in 1787 was about the creation of two different chambers. But more than that, going back again to something that James Madison wrote about, this this bicameral Congress, this two-chambered Congress, what he explained later on is actually it can actually accomplish some other things, because he wrote, as I've already said, that Congress is in a representative democracy, in a Republican form of government, is by nature going to be the dominant branch, because it all starts there. They're the lawmaking branch, and the other two branches are reactionary. And because it's so powerful, James Madison argued that what they've done in creating two chambers, and then fine-tuning the instructions for both of those chambers in the Constitution, James Madison said that what we've done is we've we've taken the most dominant branch and split it in two, and we've done it on purpose. And we pitted the two chambers against one another. One chamber is going to have the authority to do one thing, and the other chamber is going to have the authority to do other things. They're going to be elected at different times. Remember, 6-year terms for the Senate and 2-year terms for the House. The Senate, as we'll learn, has a role that the House doesn't have, and the House has a role that the Senate doesn't have. And so we're pitting these two chambers against one another, which is a way to kind of harness the power of people in government positions. And remember that apart from creating government, what a constitution will also do is provide operating instructions. And so when you're talking about operating instructions in the Constitution for these two chambers and pitting their powers against one another, and you'll learn more about that later on. You've heard about the checks and balances of the three branches, but there are also checks and balances in the Congress itself between these two chambers. And we'll learn more about that as we move along.